June 1943. A train rolled across the wide plains of Texas. Inside, nearly 2,000 German prisoners of war, men of the Afrika Korps, sat in silence, staring through the glass. What they saw outside contradicted everything they had been told. Electric lights burned in every farmhouse, on every street corner, stretching like a constellation across the night. Cars lined the roads. Families shopped under bright windows at 10 o'clock at night. In Germany, blackouts had turned the Reich into darkness since 1940. Yet here, the decadent America they had mocked was glowing with light and life. One sergeant wrote secretly in his diary, "The Americans must be lying. No nation could live with such abundance while fighting a war on two fronts." But he was wrong. In that moment, under the endless Texas night, the defeat of Nazism had already begun. Not through bombs or fire, but through the silent proof of a greater truth. Power does not come from destruction, it comes from creation. This is the story of the German soldiers who came to America as conquerors and left as believers in democracy. A conquest not by weapons, but by light, abundance, and humanity. May 1943. In the North African desert, the sun burned like fire over the shattered bones of the Afrika Korps. Charred Panzer hulls dotted the dunes. Black smoke curled upward from silent 88mm guns. Here, at Cape Bon, General Jürgen von Arnim, successor to Rommel, signed the surrender. Nearly 275,000 German and Italian soldiers laid down their arms. Many were veterans who had once pushed the British all the way to Egypt. They believed the war would continue somewhere else, Italy perhaps, or France. None of them knew their next battlefield would be Texas, and that their greatest defeat would happen without a single shot fired. Temporary cages rose quickly outside Oran, Algeria. Tens of thousands of German prisoners crowded behind wire fences under the burning sun. And then, something unexpected. American MPs lined them up, photographed them, issued ID cards, and explained, in fluent German, their rights under the Geneva Convention. They were fed, treated, and spoken to with calm efficiency. Letters later found said, "In Oran, they gave us white bread, real coffee, fresh fruit, and meat twice a day. They are not the barbarians we were told about. Everything is in order. Too orderly." For the first time, the soldiers of the Reich met an enemy that behaved with discipline, not hatred. In June, convoys of Liberty ships waited off the Algerian coast. Each could carry 3,000 prisoners. These ships, built in just 4.5 days at Kaiser shipyards, were proof of an industrial miracle. German officers who had mocked American chaos watched in disbelief as entire fleets moved with clockwork precision. They saw radar turning silently atop a cargo ship, technology they thought only Germany possessed. Colonel Wilhelm von Stobern wrote, "When I saw a radar on a merchant vessel, I knew we are already defeated, even if no one will admit it." On deck, prisoners glimpsed sailors throwing leftover meat and fresh bread into the sea. The ocean smelled faintly of grease and wheat. One sergeant whispered, "They throw away more food in a day than my company ate in a week." The shock was not hunger, but plenty. For men who had marched across a starving Europe, America seemed not a nation, but a myth of endless supply. Every Liberty ship was a floating classroom. Without speeches, without slogans, it taught a lesson. Industrial strength built on freedom works better than any empire built on fear. August 2nd, 1943, the ships reached Norfolk, Virginia. As the hatches opened, sunlight poured onto endless docks, cranes, warehouses, locomotives, trucks, all moving in synchronized rhythm. This port unloads more cargo in one day, a prisoner noted, than Hamburg could handle in a week. From there, trains waited, clean Pullman cars, not freight wagons, upholstered seats, dining coaches, silverware, white linen. The men sat in silence as the train began its long journey south. They stared through glass at towns lit like jewels in the night. Martinsville, Greensboro, Knoxville, Louisville, electric light everywhere. In Germany, blackouts had darkened every city since 1940. Yet here, even small towns shone brighter than Berlin ever had. Lieutenant Hans Müller wrote, "Each city we passed had more light than all of Hamburg combined. The guard told me, 'Wait until you see Texas.' I called him a liar." At Roanoke, Virginia, the train stopped to take on water. The prisoners watched electric cranes, automatic coal feeders, lubrication lines. What took 2 hours in Germany finished in 30 minutes. An engineer among them calculated quietly, "This station uses more electricity in 1 hour than my entire Berlin neighborhood in a day." For the first time, they grasped the scale of American energy. Power not from ideology, but from voltage. Crossing Kentucky, factories blurred past the windows, Alcoa smelters glowing white, Rubber Town with its synthetic rubber towers, Detroit's horizon crowned by Willow Run, Ford's immense plant. Every 63 minutes, a B-24 Liberator rolled off its line. 1 plane per hour, 24 hours a day. Pilot Werner Verley wrote, "We were told American planes were weak, carelessly built. Yet I saw precision, cleanliness, and light. Bombers came out of those hangars like bread from an oven. We can never win against this." The further south they traveled, the quieter the cars became. No one spoke of victory anymore. Men stared out at the landscapes of plenty, machines, roads, cars, power lines, and realized they had been fighting a phantom. The Reich's propaganda had promised order and superiority. What they saw instead was freedom that produced efficiency, and that was more frightening than any weapon. June 4th, 1943. The train stopped in Mexia, Texas. The whole town had gathered to watch. No jeering, no stones, only quiet curiosity. Some women brought water for the guards. Children waved small flags. Sergeant Burkhart wrote, "We were ready to be humiliated. No one cursed us. They looked at us not as monsters, but as men who had lost their way." The camp lights flickered on, rows of bright bulbs under the warm Texas sky. For the first time in years, the Germans stood beneath a sky that glowed. Some wept, not because they had lost the war, but because they realized they had lived in darkness for far too long. From the burning sands of Tunisia to a quiet town in Texas, their journey crossed more than an ocean. It crossed the line between illusion and reality. Hitler had called America decadent, chaotic, doomed. Yet in Texas, they saw a nation alive with order, energy, and humanity. And that was the first crack in the armor of the Reich. A battle fought not with bullets, but with light bulbs, engines, and the dignity of freedom. The gates closed behind them with a heavy metallic clang. Floodlights cast long shadows across the sand. Camp Hearne, Texas, built in just 4 months, was now home to almost 5,000 German prisoners. The men expected hunger, cold, humiliation. Instead, they found electric lights, hot showers, and clean beds. Each barrack had running water, flush toilets, and steam heating. Lieutenant Friedrich Rodke wrote, "We entered as soldiers of the Reich, but slept that night in comfort greater than most German civilians. The shock was not luxury, it was decency. An enemy that could build such order for its captives had already defeated them in a deeper way. Within days, the camp hospital opened its doors. Inside were X-ray machines, surgical rooms, and fully stocked pharmacies. Even minor infections were treated with penicillin, a drug most German doctors had only heard about in rumor. Dr. Friedrich Bauer, former chief surgeon of the 164th Light Division, later testified, "We were dying for lack of sulfur drugs in Africa. Here they gave us penicillin freely, even for scratches. They treated us better than our own army treated its wounded." Then came the meals. The kitchen gleamed with stainless steel, gas ranges, electric mixers, walk-in refrigerators. Breakfast, milk, eggs, fruit. Lunch, meat, bread, vegetables. Dinner, coffee, butter, pie. Feldwebel Otto Krebs, once a hotel chef in Munich, wrote, "Today we threw away more food than my family had seen in 3 years. Not spoiled food, simply excess. The regulations require 10% surplus. I wept as I threw good bread into the trash. Abundance became the Americans' most powerful weapon. Not a rifle, not a bomb, but a plate of food, served without malice." By late summer 1943, labor shortages pulled prisoners out of the camps. Every morning, trucks carried groups into the fields, to sawmills, to factories. They worked beside American civilians, farmers, mechanics, warehouse workers. They saw everything. "No blindfolds," one guard explained. "There's nothing here we're afraid for you to see." And what they saw changed them forever. In the cotton fields outside Houston, Herbert Lang, a 23-year-old corporal from Bavaria, watched a farmer's gin process more cotton in 1 hour than his entire village could have done in a month. The machine was powered by electricity from the Colorado River Authority, part of the Rural Electrification Program, a system that had brought power to 90% of Texas farms by 1943. Lang wrote, "This man was no aristocrat, no party member, just a farmer. Yet he had a truck, a car, running water, and electricity. Even the Negro workers ate lunches richer than German laborers. And this was normal. It was the first direct encounter with the idea that prosperity could exist without oppression. In Nebraska, prisoners worked the wheat fields. They saw a single combine harvester replace 100 men. Fields stretched beyond sight, measured not in acres but in horizons. Farmers spoke casually of yields twice that of Germany's best land. A 16-year-old boy drove a tractor worth more than my father's lifetime earnings," wrote Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann. "He laughed and said it wasn't even a good one. His father was waiting for the new John Deere model. The laughter hurt more than insults ever could. It revealed how far behind the Reich truly was. Rules forbade prisoners from war-related production, but they were allowed to work in supporting industries, canneries, mills, food plants. At a Campbell's soup factory in New Jersey, German workers watched electric conveyor belts, steam cookers, and automatic filling machines run by a handful of women and elderly men. One woman controlled a system that replaced 50 workers, wrote Ernst Wagner. She monitored gauges while drinking coffee and listening to music. Our factories could not have matched this, even with slave labor. Every day was a quiet humiliation. The revelation that freedom and productivity were not enemies. Near Detroit, prisoners unloading coal glimpsed the River Rouge complex, a plant so vast it consumed 1.5 million kilowatts daily, more than the entire city of Hamburg. Oberrichter Franz Kellner wrote, "We saw thousands of cars in the workers' parking lots. In Germany, even our officers rarely owned cars. Here, factory laborers drove to work, and some had too. The myth of decadent America collapsed under the weight of its own evidence. By winter 1943, American intelligence noticed the change. Reports spoke of ideological collapse syndrome. Prisoners stopped arguing. The most loyal Nazis grew silent. Major Paul Nowlan of the Special Projects Division wrote, "They have seen too much. They no longer believe what they once shouted. Their silence is not defiance. It is awakening." The American response was subtle. They did not preach. They allowed observation. Books, newspapers, lectures, all available voluntarily. Soon camp newspapers appeared, edited by prisoners, at first full of nationalist slogans, later filled with debates on democracy, economy, and post-war reconstruction. Lieutenant Herman Gutz wrote, "We were told America was a mongrel nation, weak, divided, ruled by Jews. But every day here I see the opposite. They are the most united, organized, and powerful people on earth. The pen replaced the rifle. Learning replaced command. And truth began to seep in, quietly, irreversibly." In September 1943, Italy surrendered. Italian prisoners who agreed to cooperate with the Allies were given better pay, freedom of movement, and civilian jobs. The Germans watched in disbelief. Their former allies, once beneath them, now ate in American restaurants, worked beside American soldiers, even dated American women. Feldwebel Friedrich Schultz wrote, "The Italians betrayed us, yet they are treated better than we ever treated them. This democracy we despise seems more honorable than our own." The humiliation was total, but with it came the first spark of understanding. Then came Christmas. American churches, charities, and civic groups sent 500,000 packages to German prisoners filled with candy, cigarettes, games, and cards. Local choirs came to sing Silent Night in German. Women baked cakes and cookies for men whose armies had bombed their sons. Boy Scouts hand-delivered homemade cards saying, "Peace on Earth." Lieutenant Walter Miller wrote, "They know we are their enemies. Yet they show us kindness, true, simple kindness. Only people certain of victory can be so generous." That night, the prisoners feasted on turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, and pies stacked high with cream. They ate until they were sick. Feldwebel Hans Meyer whispered, "We eat better than generals. If this is how they treat prisoners, how do they feed their soldiers?" For many, that night was the turning point. They began to understand that moral power, not brute strength, was the real engine of America's victory. By early 1944, new waves of German POWs arrived. Fresh from Normandy, from Italy, from the Atlantic, they entered camps filled with men already changed. The older prisoners welcomed them not with slogans, but with questions. "Do you still believe it? That we were the master race?" Inside those fences, the Nazi dream died quietly. Not by violence, but by evidence. Education programs expanded. By summer 1944, more than 40,000 prisoners were enrolled in courses. They studied English, economics, history, and agriculture. Professors from American universities volunteered to teach. Dr. Wilhelm von Braun, a physicist from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, attended lectures on atomic energy. He wrote, "American professors, many of them Jews exiled from Germany, taught us without hatred. They spoke of science as belonging to all mankind. We were years behind, and they still shared freely. Such generosity destroyed the last illusions of racial superiority." Evenings brought another shock. Film screenings. Not propaganda, but regular Hollywood films. They watched Gone with the Wind and saw people who had survived defeat and rebuilt. They watched The Grapes of Wrath and saw poverty portrayed honestly on screen. Lieutenant Joseph Kramer wrote, "They hide nothing. They show their flaws to the world. In Germany, such truth would mean death. Here it is patriotism. For men trained to worship perfection, this honesty was blinding. It showed that strength could coexist with vulnerability, that freedom, despite its chaos, created resilience. Outside the fences, the war raged on. Inside, another war unfolded. One fought in silence, in thought, in shame, and revelation. And slowly the same men who once raised their arms in salute began raising them to ask questions. How had they been deceived so completely? Why had they followed so willingly? And why in defeat did they feel freer than they ever had in victory? By the end of 1944, the transformation was undeniable. The men who had arrived as enemies were now students of technology, of democracy, of human decency. What guns and bombs had failed to destroy, electric light, abundance, and dignity had quietly dismantled. The Reich soldiers had entered Texas to endure captivity. Instead, they encountered civilization, and it conquered them completely. By the winter of 1944, Camp Hearne no longer echoed with marching songs. The shouting, the salutes, the clenched fists were gone. In their place came silence, long evenings, and thought. The Germans had survived the battlefield, but here in the stillness of Texas, they began to face a different kind of war. A war inside their own minds. No bombs fell, no orders shouted, only the hum of electricity and the whisper of conscience. At first, it showed in small things. Arguments over newspapers, shame during prayers, sudden quiet during mealtime. Some officers still preached loyalty to the Führer, but fewer listened. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann wrote, "The true battle is no longer against the Americans. It is between who we were and what we now know." For many, the deepest wound was not hunger or confinement. It was comparison. Every day they saw that what Nazi propaganda had promised was being lived out by their enemies. They were supposed to be the superior race, yet they worked for farmers who treated them kindly. They were told democracy was weak, yet they watched its machinery build faster than the Reich ever could. They believed mercy was weakness, but mercy had become the thing they feared most, because it disarmed them completely. In Iowa, Hans Müller, once a devout Nazi, worked for an American farmer named Daniel Rees. Rees never spoke politics. He simply treated his workers, German, Mexican, Black, the same. At lunch, they sat together on the same bench. Rees's wife brought out sandwiches for everyone. Müller wrote later, "I had seen men killed for less than this, equality at a table. I waited for him to tell us where to sit. He never did. And that silence broke something inside me." Some began secretly writing to American pen pals, church members, teachers, widows, even students. They traded stories, postcards, recipes, books. The guards allowed it. It was not propaganda. It was human contact. By spring 1944, over 10,000 letters a week passed through the POW postal system. Many began with the same sentence. "I did not know Americans were like this." These words, simple and unplanned, became confessions of awakening. For men raised on order and obedience, the absence of orders was terrifying. In Germany, everything had been dictated: what to read, what to say, how to think. Now they were told, "You are free to choose," and they didn't know how. Oberleutnant Wilhelm Steiner wrote, "Freedom was more difficult than captivity. To obey is simple, to think is agony." Some spent nights staring at the ceiling, haunted not by bombs, but by realization. They had fought for an idea that no longer existed, and now that void stared back at them. Not all prisoners accepted defeat. A small group of die-hard Nazis formed secret cells. They called themselves the Loyalists. They threatened others, burned American books, and whispered of eventual revenge. At Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, a prisoner named Johannes Kunze was murdered by fellow Germans. After speaking admiringly of American fairness, the killers left a note pinned to his body for betrayal of the fatherland. It was the last echo of the old Reich within the wire. But it backfired. The murder horrified other prisoners. They realized what Nazism truly was. Not patriotism, but fear dressed as loyalty. After Tonkawa, everything changed. The Americans quietly removed fanatical officers, transferring them to isolated compounds. The remaining men, freed from internal terror, began to open their eyes. Conversations that once risked death now filled the evenings. Philosophy, democracy, faith, art. The camps turned into schools. The students were soldiers learning to become men again. American clergy, teachers, and civic groups visited the camps. They brought books, musical instruments, and newspapers. Some gave lectures on economics or government. Others simply listened. Reverend Thomas Hughes, a Texas chaplain, wrote in his diary, "We do not preach democracy, we live it in front of them. They must see it breathe." At night, prisoners staged plays. They rebuilt Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, but in the final scene, replaced Caesar's last words with their own, "We are all Brutus." The audience applauded in silence, aware of what it meant. Art became their confession, music their repentance. Even within captivity, they found a kind of freedom they had never known in the Reich. Then came the news. Bombings in Hamburg, Dresden, Berlin. Cities they had grown up in, gone. Families scattered. Letters stopped arriving. And rumors, terrible rumors about concentration camps. At first, no one believed them. They called it American lies. But soon proof arrived. In April 1945, American officers gathered the prisoners into recreation halls. They showed them films from Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. They showed piles of bodies, ovens, skeletal survivors. The rooms went silent. Some shouted denial. Others cried. A few fainted. But most sat motionless, as if a part of them had died on that screen. Lieutenant Otto Schmidt wrote, "We had believed we were warriors of civilization. That film showed us what we had truly built, a factory of death. It was the day my soul split in two. For days men refused to eat. They stopped playing soccer, stopped singing. Even the guards walked quietly. The Americans did not gloat. They handed out leaflets of facts, eyewitness accounts, and let the prisoners talk among themselves. And slowly the realization sank in. They were not the victims of war. They were the perpetrators of something far worse. That understanding was unbearable. It was the hell within. Some turned to faith. Camp chapels filled with men kneeling in silence. Others wrote long letters to families, confessions disguised as news. If God allows us to return, one man wrote, we must rebuild Germany not with pride, but with shame and hope. The Americans read these words quietly and made a decision. To teach, not punish. To transform, not destroy. Spring 1945. University professors from Chicago, Stanford, and Texas arrived at the camps. They lectured on democracy, law, and free markets. Not as propaganda, but as ideas to be tested, questioned, challenged. Prisoners debated fiercely how freedom worked, why equality didn't weaken discipline, how nations could be powerful without conquest. They came to realize something terrifying, that the future they fought to prevent was the only one worth living in. The last battle of the German soldier was not in Normandy or Berlin. It was here, in his heart, when he chose to stop defending the lie and begin believing in truth. It was a battle fought in silence, with no witnesses, no medals, and no glory. But it was the most important one he ever fought. By the end of spring 1945, many camps resembled small universities. The prisoners painted, wrote essays, published their own newspapers, some openly critical of Nazism. Sergeant Paul Hartman wrote in one, "We came to America as slaves of ideology. We will leave as students of freedom." This was not propaganda victory. It was psychological resurrection. Freedom had taught itself simply by existing. The Germans had learned that captivity could be a form of liberation, that defeat could be education, and that the true battlefield was not on the map, but in the conscience of man. They had entered the camp surrounded by barbed wire. But by the end, the only fences left were inside their minds. And those were finally beginning to fall. March 1945. Across the Atlantic, Germany was burning. The Reich collapsed city by city. Dresden, Cologne, Berlin. In Texas, the news arrived through shortwave radios and camp newspapers. Men who once cheered victory now read casualty lists in silence. Inside the barracks, the flag that had ruled their lives, the swastika, was gone. In its place hung nothing, a blank wall, a void that mirrored what they felt inside. When Allied armies liberated the concentration camps, American officers gathered the prisoners once again. They projected films, images too cruel for imagination. Buchenwald, Dachau, Auschwitz, skeletal bodies stacked like wood, civilians walking in horror through the ruins of their own denial. The room at Camp Hearne stayed utterly still. No one spoke. No one moved. Sergeant Otto Schmidt wrote later, "We thought we were soldiers of honor. That day we saw we were the servants of murderers." The film ended. The lights stayed off. For the first time, the silence was not obedience. It was grief. The Americans did not gloat. No speeches of victory, no revenge. Instead, they handed out booklets, factual reports, testimonies, statistics, and left the men alone to read. They wanted us to understand, not to hate ourselves, remembered Corporal Hans Wehe. That difference mattered. It planted something the Nazis had tried to kill, the ability to think for oneself. By spring 1945, classrooms filled again. Prisoners studied the U.S. Constitution, economics, science, and ethics. More than 40,000 enrolled in formal courses. 8,000 took university correspondence programs. Lecturers came from Harvard, Chicago, Stanford. They spoke not of ideology, but of process, how free societies debate, correct, and adapt. Dr. Wilhelm von Braun, a physicist from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, wrote, "In America, even disagreement is organized. Here argument is not treason, it is progress. To men raised on orders, this was revelation. To question became an act of courage. Chaplains reported record attendance at Sunday services. Crosses were carved from scrap wood. Choirs sang hymns learned from American hymnals. Songs of mercy instead of victory. One guard recalled standing outside a chapel at dusk, listening to German voices singing Amazing Grace in broken English. He wept, not from pity, but from recognition. We were no longer enemies, he said, just men trying to find forgiveness. In April, prisoners began writing letters that would cross the ocean. Just as the war ended, they wrote not of hatred or revenge, but of building, farming, studying, living differently. We must rebuild Germany without arrogance. One man wrote, and learn to be ordinary without shame. Many would return to find their homes gone, their families scattered, their cities ashes, but they would carry something the rubble could not destroy: knowledge of how freedom worked. Between 1945 and 1946, over 370,000 German POWs were repatriated from American soil. Trains rolled north from Texas to New York, then ships crossed the Atlantic --. The same Liberty hulls that had once brought them captive. They boarded as changed men. Some cried silently as they saw the Statue of Liberty fade behind them. They had come to America as conquerors. They left as students. Back in ruined Germany, these former prisoners became seeds of renewal. They rebuilt farms using American machinery. They organized local councils modeled on American town meetings. They started newspapers dedicated to free speech. They spoke in schools about the dangers of obedience without thought. Some rose to prominence. Hans Kroll, once a POW at Camp Shelby, became West Germany's ambassador to the United States. Walter Hallstein, a camp educator, became president of the European Commission. Others, unknown men, simply built houses, tilled fields, and refused ever again to salute blindly. We learned that prosperity comes from freedom, not conquest, Kroll wrote. That diversity creates strength, and that dignity is worth more than fear. Historians later called it the greatest re-education program in history. It required no coercion, no propaganda, only evidence. Every electric light, every meal, every fair-minded guard was an argument against tyranny. Each act of mercy became a bullet in the heart of fascism. Dr. Arnold Kramer concluded, America won the propaganda war through reality itself. The prisoners were converted not by words but by what they saw every day. 40 years later, in 1985, 500 former German prisoners returned to Texas. They gathered in Austin for a reunion. Gray-haired men shaking hands with the guards who once watched them. Photographs show smiles, tears, and laughter under the same Texas sky. At dinner, Dr. Hermann Goetz, now 78, gave a toast. We came to America as Nazis and left as men who had seen the truth. You defeated us not with hatred, but with humanity. You taught us that creation is stronger than destruction, and that freedom is the only empire worth building. The hall stood in silence, then rose in a long ovation that blurred the line between victor and vanquished. The German economic miracle of the 1950s was born not only from the Marshall Plan, but from lessons learned behind barbed wire. Factories rebuilt with American efficiency. Democracy rooted in memory of captivity, a nation resurrected from guilt by imitation of its former enemy's virtue. Those men carried America within them. Not its flag, but its spirit. They became Europe's bridge to the free world. In the end, America's greatest weapon was never its bombs or tanks. It was its example, a society that could feed its prisoners, educate its enemies, and rebuild its foes instead of enslaving them. The German POWs had come believing in supremacy. They left believing in humanity. Their journey proved a profound truth: the most enduring victories are not written in blood, but in understanding. They had arrived on trains filled with arrogance. They departed on ships filled with hope.